Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Hero with 1,000 Voices. This channel will be doing deep dives on fantasy literature with an eye on the mechanics of storytelling. I will be starting with one of the most detailed and layered fantasy series ever written, A Song of Ice and Fire. Though the series is not finished, we're going to look at how to interpret historical, mythological, literary, and folkloric reference in the series, and how it affects the plot and characters. So without any further ado, let's start with what the setting of A Song of Ice and Fire is based on: the War of the Roses.
Roses are boring, dear.
Over the course of 32 years, England was involved in a brutal succession crisis. History buffs out there will have much more detailed and nuanced sources for historical information, and some of you will have eyes that glaze over if I start droning on about names and dates. For both your sakes, I will be mercifully brief. The War of the Roses was a series of civil wars between claimants to the throne of England from House Lancaster and House York. The House of Lancaster was descended from Henry IV, a first cousin to King Richard II. His son, Henry V, followed, best known for his victory over the French at Agincourt with Welsh longbowmen. He died very young, only 9 months after fathering Henry VI. When Queen Catherine of France's father died 2 months later, Henry VI also became King of France. Quite the list of accomplishments before hitting 1 year old. Regencies were set up to rule in his name in both France and England. At age 7, Henry VI began ruling outright, though a ruling council, that included his uncle, still ran the kingdom. Upon adulthood, he married Margaret of Anjou, a princess of France, and while she was expecting her first child, Henry VI started displaying serious signs of mental illness. He was basically incapacitated for 18 months before he recovered. In addition to this, the gains England had made in France were mostly lost under his reign, and the wealth of England waned greatly. Now, this is where the war essentially starts. Henry VI was not capable of running a kingdom during his 18 months of mental illness, and his claim of recovery seemed very dubious. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the Lancasters supported King Henry VI. On the other, those who supported one they deemed to be a more stable monarch, the camp of the Duke of York's son, Edward IV. The Lancasters displayed the red rose, the Yorks displayed the white rose. These were the two branches of the royal house of Plantagenet. Now, if this sounds familiar after reading A Song of Ice and Fire, it means you've been paying attention. The Lannisters are located close to the west coast of Westeros, much like the Lancasters were in England. The Lannisters wear red and gold with a lion sigil and continuously try to marry into House Tyrell's red rose. A lion sigil is the most common symbol of a Sun King, a very popular symbol in fantasy, mythology, and literature. Now moving to the Starks, who are loosely based on the Yorks. The Starks don't display a white rose, but you will find a lot of blue winter roses prominent in their backstory, most notably with Lyanna Stark, the mother of Jon Snow with Rhaegar Targaryen. Sorry to those of you with theories about Brandon, Ashara, and Moonboy for all we know, but George has confirmed that Rhaegar and Lyanna are Jon's parents. This makes him the direct descendant of the royal line, and Jon sneakily inherits his mother's blue winter rose symbolism in a few scenes, not least of which is Dany's dream vision of a blue flower growing out of a chink in the wall, giving off sweetness. Now, before we go deep into rose symbolism, let's acknowledge the founding of the Tudor line. After 32 years of war and many deaths among the royal claimants and nobility vying for power, a solution presented itself. Edward III, whom both the Lancastrians and Yorks descended from, had a third surviving son. That son was John Beaufort, and, unfortunately, he was illegitimate. His parents later married when he was 25, and by way of papal decree, John Beaufort was declared legitimate. This was nice for John, but it wasn't relevant in his lifetime for the line of succession, as his older brother, Henry IV, had just become king and his line would become the Lancasters. During the War of the Roses, the male lines of both the Yorkists and the Lancasters would die out, giving the best claim to the throne to Elizabeth of York. With the power of York and Lancaster largely spent after 32 years of war, a new army swept over the armies of King Richard III, the last York king. This was the army of Henry Tudor. His father Edmund was a half-brother to Edward IV, founder of the Lancasters, and his mother was John Beaufort's daughter, Margaret. When Edward IV retook the throne from Henry Tudor's half-brother, Tudor spent 14 years living in exile in Brittany. With the whole of the British Isles sick of fighting, Henry Tudor had a lot of support. With additional support from his Welsh relatives, his French allies in exile, in Scotland as well, he became the last English king to win his throne on the battlefield. He then cemented his claim and pacified the Yorks by marrying Elizabeth of York, who had the strongest remaining claim to the throne. Okay, that's a lot of information. Let's break it down. What we have is a bastard who becomes legitimate, named John, who fathers a kingly line, and a man becoming king after returning to England after 14 years in exile, who then marries his closest rival for the throne. Jon Snow is a bastard, possibly to be legitimized, or perhaps legitimate all along, we just don't know. If he is legitimate, he has the strongest claim to the throne of Westeros. Dany has one of the other strongest claims and has been living in exile for just over 14 years. If the show is to be believed, Jon and Dany are on a romantic crash course. Now, ignoring the gross factor of incest both in real-world royalty and A Song of Ice and Fire, George has created a pretty good echo of the War of the Roses. The Tudors have a lot in common with Targaryens. The Yorks are a lot like Starks. The Lancasters are similar to Lannisters. And Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII of England, basically represents all three on his coat of arms. His coat of arms is quartered with 2 blue fields with the French fleur-de-lis, 2 red fields with 3 of the Golden Lion of England, supported on both sides by the red Tudor dragon and the white greyhound of Richmond. Basically, his coat of arms is what would happen if we combined our 3 favorite A Song of Ice and Fire houses into House Lannis-Targaryen. I realize for a lot of you the historical aspect of this is pretty dry. There are entirely too many people with similar names, entirely too many incestuous family trees, and too many dates to remember. So let's get back to the book that caused you to click on my video in the first place. George has left hints to the War of the Roses in rose symbolism all across his world. In George's world, symbolism isn't for nothing. If you've ever read his blog or watched his interviews, you know that George prefers gray characters over dark lords and white knights, and that he thinks it is a disservice to a fantasy world to have symbolism without a purpose in plots and character arcs. So let's go pick some flowers. A common trope of many pagan traditions is the endless seasonal battle of the Holly and Oak Kings. The Holly King murders the Oak King in autumn to rule over winter, and the Oak King is resurrected in the spring, avenges himself on the Holly King, and rules over summer. Sometimes these 2 kings are brothers, sometimes father and son, sometimes they're the same person, morphing into each kingly version as the seasons change. The details of their relationships and identity are less important than the idea that they represent a seasonal cycle. These aspects of summer and winter are often considered the dual aspects of the horned god. We see the horned god or lord all across different mythologies, sometimes even with antlers instead of horns. Santa Claus, Father Winter, or whatever you would like to call him, is heavily rooted in Holly King lore. If you can remember the ghost of Christmas Present from A Christmas Carol, or even the Jolly Green Giant, you've seen representations of the Oak King. George has placed a long history of Oak Kings in A Song of Ice and Fire. The archetype of this, most on the nose, are the Gardener Kings of the Reach, who ruled from the oaken seat of Highgarden. George could have gone horse screaming Oak King here. The Gardener Kings are said to be direct descendants of Garth the Green, who either wore or had antlers, and either wore green or had green skin. Now let's connect this with the current storyline. Just like Garth, Robert Baratheon is known for wearing antlers. They are part of the war helms of House Baratheon, and have their roots in the previous Stormlands kings the Baratheons married into and took over from, the Durrandons. Now, aside from many kings named Durin Durrandon being an eye-roll reference to the rock band Duran Duran, they gave their arms, sigil, traditions, and castle to the Baratheons. Robert should be thought of as a Garth figure, and by extension, an Oak King. So let's look at his interactions with the Holly Winter King, his good friend Ned Stark. The Starks rule from Winterfell, and before the Targaryens arrived, they were styled the Kings of Winter. Not exactly subtle. It is still summer when Robert arrives in Winterfell, and as such, the Winter King Ned greets Robert on one knee, subservient to the Oak King of Summer. Oak King Robert then goes down to the Winterfell crypts to foreshadow his own death in as many ways as possible and lament that he was never able to have the blue rose-associated maiden he was obsessed with, Ned's sister, Lyanna. She is associated with blue winter roses because she is given a flower crown of blue winter roses as the Queen of Love and Beauty at the tourney of Harrenhal by the Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. When Ned thinks of her, he thinks of her fondness for blue winter roses. When he dreams of her death at the Tower of Joy, he sees blue winter roses. Even in Ygritte's story about Bael the Bard, Bael replaces the Stark daughter he takes with a blue winter rose. A parallel figure to Lyanna, this is more reinforcement of the symbolism. Now, why would Robert, an Oak King, want a blue winter rose queen? Well, turns out George places some sneaky rose symbolism in House Baratheon, literally in the name. George's favorite author is J.R.R. Tolkien, who took a lot of care in naming his characters and had a background as an academic linguist. Tolkien would have been somewhat well known as a talented professor who made great translations of a lot of mythical stories had he never written a word of fantasy. And George is a fanboy. He emulates Tolkien in this respect, and there is symbolism or reference as well as linguistic roots in every name in the series, and I do mean every single one. So let's look at Baratheon. I will say there are multiple translations that all have meaning within the story. I'm just looking at one. Theon is a derivative of the Greek theos, meaning god or of the gods. This is no surprise. Robert has combined motifs of storm and horned gods. He wears an antlered helm that is symbolically interchangeable with horns for the horned god. He swings a gigantic hammer and has a voice like booming thunder, doing a pretty good job of cosplaying Thor. Now we look at Bara, and the etymological root that stuck out to me was that in Japanese, it means rose. Now you're probably thinking right about now that I'm reaching, that this was unintentional. I appreciate your skepticism, but I think I can sell you on it. If you've ever played the game Okami, you know about the Japanese Shinto goddess Amaterasu. If you've ever read The World of Ice and Fire, you may remember the Maiden Maid of Light as a deity of Yi Ti and its predecessor, the Great Empire of the Dawn. Well, they're almost exactly the same. They're both sun gods. They both turned their bright face away from the world and caused an extended night. Amaterasu only brought back the day when her brother, who had given her great insult and caused all this, gave her a divine magic sword by way of apology. Think of the return of the day as dawn, and now associate this sword with the magic sword in A Song of Ice and Fire called Dawn. The people of the Great Empire of the Dawn claimed descent in their rulers from the Maiden Maid of Light. The people of Japan claimed descent in their rulers from Amaterasu when she took mortal form. So this woman who caused the long night, in an in-world mythological tradition, is basically copy-pasted from Japanese mythology. And it shows that George has definitely looked at Shinto mythology. All over the world, people have bred all sorts of roses, in many colors, but never blue. It's actually impossible. They don't contain the pigment delphinidin necessary to express the color blue. In 2004, it was done through genetic modification, but never naturally. Historically, especially in Japan, the blue rose was meant to symbolize mystery, the unattainable, and winter in the spirit realm. So assigning Baratheon as the meaning rose god to King Robert, then having him obsess over Lyanna, the maiden of the blue winter rose, is both a potent metaphor and starts to remove the idea that this could have been done on accident. Lyanna died, and she was never in love with Robert, so she is a perfect representation of the mysterious and unattainable blue winter rose. Of course he'd be obsessed with her. It's actually not even the end of this Baratheon rose association. Renly, Robert's brother, who is described as both Robert come again and Robert's ghost, allies with Highgarden with a marriage to Margaery Tyrell, while in a less political romance with her brother Loras Tyrell. Before Robert's death, he was hatching a plot to marry Margaery to Robert, so let's not forget that the Tyrell sigil is a red rose. These rose people sit on the Oakenseat, the greatest symbol of Oak Kings in Westeros, formerly of Garth the Green and the Gardener Kings, and they're constantly plotting to marry into the throne. The Baratheon and Rose association continues when Renly's Castellan at Storm's End, Courtney Penrose, refuses to yield the castle to Stannis. Stannis is also a Baratheon rose god, and he of course sends his wife's uncle, Alester Florent, to speak to Penrose. House Florent are basically a Diet House Stark. Their fox is a poor man's direwolf, and they circle the fox sigil in blue winter roses just to make sure you understand they are both Rose and Holly King associated. After Penrose sends Alester off, Stannis sends a Melisandre maid shadow baby to kill him. Only 2 characters are killed by shadow babies, Renly Baratheon and Courtney Penrose. If you know your Arthurian lore, you know that Arthur and his father Uther's house name was Pendragon, which basically meant Dragon King. That makes Courtney Penrose a Rose King. The Rose King is a Stormlander house that swears fealty to House Baratheon, because kings rule at the grace of gods. The Florents aren't done with their Baratheon association either. Aside from being the loudest whiners when the Tyrells became Lords of the Reach instead of them, and aside from marrying into Stannis Baratheon's house, one of them mothered a royal bastard with Robert. Stannis is still upset that they did it in his wedding bed, but Robert had a child with a blue winter rose lady and named their son Edric Storm, the southern version of Eddard, just in case you weren't sold on the blue winter rose and Holly King connection. So Robert couldn't get his blue winter rose queen, wasn't interested in red rose Margaery, and fathered a royal bastard with a blue winter rose Delaena Florent in poor imitation of Lyanna. Even the language in some of these interactions reinforces George's rose symbolism.
You know me for a man of honor. I know you for a man of ambition, a man who changes kings and gods the way I change my boots.
Alester is trying to end the siege of Storm's End, and fails, something Ned Stark did successfully during Robert's rebellion. He dubiously claims himself a man of honor, something Ned Stark is actually known for. Courtney insults him by talking about how he changes kings and gods. Courtney is a Penrose, which literally means Rose King, serving at Storm's End, castle of the Baratheon Rose gods. And just like how Robert is chasing after a blue winter rose queen, like Lyanna or Delaena, to try and make a Holly King son, like Edric, Alester and his whole house want to steal the Oakenseat throne of the Oak Kings from the Red Rose Tyrells. Their rivalry makes a whole lot of sense on both a narrative and symbolic level. The Florents were furious that the Targaryens gave Highgarden to the Tyrells, thinking that they were the most ancient and noble house in the Reach. Lord Alester wears red and gold armor, neither color being on their sigil, because they are Lannister colors. This is not the narrative reason, to be clear. It is a reference to the fact that the Lannisters are based on the Red Rose and Golden Lancasters. And when Brightwater Keep, the historic seat of House Florent, is taken away from them for supporting Stannis, it is given by the crown to Garland Tyrell, an Oak King Rose whose name is derivative of Garth and sounds a lot like garland, which of course is a wreath or crown of flowers. Let's return briefly to Robert as an Oak King. He goes north into the lands of Winterfell, or just Winter, if you like. This symbolic journey of the Oak King into winter leads to his death, foreshadowed by the stag and direwolf at the beginning of the story that killed each other. This is highlighted in his death scene, where, despite the heat of the room, he says,
"Gods, why is it so cold in here?"
Robert's brother Renly picks up a lot of his symbolism, even going further in some ways with deep green armor and other such trappings. Present at Renly's death is Catelyn Stark, a Queen of Winter figure, from whose point of view we hear Renly's last word, cold. Even Jon gets a piece of this in his death scene, when he doesn't feel the fourth knife, only the cold. Since we rewinded to Robert's death scene, let's go to Lyanna's. Here is Ned's battle to save his dying sister at the Tower of Joy. "No," Ned said with sadness in his voice. "Now it ends." As they came together in a rush of steel and shadow, he could hear Lyanna screaming. "Eddard!" she called. A storm of rose petals blew across a blood-streaked sky, as blue as the eyes of death. In this series, when we hear "as blue as the eyes of death," we think of the others. The others are death-associated, they raise the dead, and their eyes, as well as their raised white's eyes, are described as blue stars. We have now equated the others with Winter King figures through the storm of rose petals in the same blue shade as the eyes of the others. The blue rose petals are a symbol of Lyanna, later a symbol of Jon, and they are also equated with death here. An understated aspect of this passage is that this is the first time we see Dorne on page, even if it's only through a hazy dream memory. One specific translation of Dorne is from the German for fist, which isn't surprising since it lies at the end of what used to be the land bridge to Essos, called the Arm of Dorne. At the end of the arm, the fist. But if we look at older Germanic language, where there is no distinction between what we now separate as a TH sound and a D sound, Dorne used to be pretty easily translatable as thorn. Now, I didn't say this to bring up Poison's "every rose has its thorn," but a thorn is the weapon of a rose. In fact, we have an example during the time of Duncan Egg of a Tyrell who was an especially gifted jouster with the nickname Leo Longthorn Tyrell. Once again, we're implying them as kings, with Leo being the constellation for lion, and lion being about the most used symbol for a sun king or god throughout history and mythology. But calling a jouster Longthorn gives the precedent that a rose knight with a long lance can be called a Longthorn. And this Rose King Thorn Knight isn't the only example. On the feminine side, in the current story, Olenna Tyrell is called the Queen of Thorns. Now, the first time we see Dorne on page, we have a blue winter rose queen, and a lot of people die trying to get to her. Reach for the rose, get the thorn. She does all this to birth Jon, and Jon doesn't even know who she is. Yet when Dany dreams of the wall, well, here's the quote. "A blue flower grew from a chink in a wall of ice and filled the air with sweetness." Okay, so Jon Snow growing into a man and leader at the wall, filling the air with sweetness. Now, I wouldn't call this foreshadowing for Jon and Dany's romance, but it sure does scream that Jon inherited his mother's symbolism to a point. I wish I could let this next one pass, but I can't. Pip called out, "Well, come about, let's have a look." "At what?" Jon said. Toad sidled close. "Your rosy butt cheeks, what else?" "The sword," Gren stated. "We want to see the sword." This isn't direct rose symbolism, but Jon's, cheeks are described as rosy here. He continues to take on rose imagery at the wall, and as he trains to become a man of the Night's Watch, who should train him in arms but Alazar Thorn? Aside from the fact that his name is literally Thorn, his first name is a lot like Alester Florent, the blue winter rose fox we just went into detail about. Both of these men display Winter King's symbolism, and both of their names are derived from a black horse of the underworld from Greek mythology, Alastor, who pulled Hades' chariot. Thorn's training of Jon isn't quite as productive in practice, and neither is his training of Samwell Tarly. As an analog of Samwise Gamgee, who married Rosie Cotton in Lord of the Rings, and a sort of sidekick to Jon for a while, Sam actually has his own rose symbolism. House Tarly play the Horn King archetype through their seat, Hornhill. They also play the Winter Holly King archetype through their founders, Herndon of the Horn and Harlan the Hunter, a clear reference to English folkloric figure Herne the Hunter. But his direct rose symbolism comes from his mother, Melissa, who is of course a Florent. Fun fact, this Thorn Man trainer of rose people has a call-out in the Bran chapter of the Night Fort. Only one crumbling wall remained of the great hall. The bathhouse seemed to be sinking into the ground, and a huge thorn bush had conquered the practice yard outside the armory where Black Brothers had once labored with spear and shield and sword. Sir Alazar Thorn runs the practice yard at Castle Black, and a thorn bush conquers the practice yard at the Night Fort. Ha ha, George. But the truth here is that Thorn and Sam are both complements to Jon's symbolism. Jon is portraying parts of several characters from the real-life War of the Roses in his arc. He has a white direwolf and Stark lineage, mirroring the white greyhound of Richmond on Henry VII Tudor's coat of arms. He is a red dragon Targaryen from his father, just like the English dragon on that same coat of arms. He has blue rose symbolism in place of the Lancaster red or York white, and he is the descendant of a secret marriage and questionable birth legitimacy. Before I start a tangent into other flowers and their symbolism within A Song of Ice and Fire, and this video ends up being 3 hours, I'll cut off here. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode and want more fantasy literature content, please consider joining my Patreon.